This is literally what separated Colonel Fitzmaurice and the crew of the Bremen from certain death in the Atlantic Ocean on the first east to west crossing in 1928. 0.5 and 0.8 millimetre thick duralumin. How could you not marvel at that? And how could you not want to find out more about the Irish airman who literally put his life on the line in the pursuit of making aviation history? I believe that good curation is all about being provocative and being questioning at every stage in the process. So last April I travelled with a small delegation from Laois out to Bremen to celebrate the 90th anniversary of the Bremen's crossing of the Atlantic. And the Bremen itself is actually on shore at Bremen Airport. And when I walked into the exhibition hall, the very first thing that struck me actually was the fragility of the aircraft. The second thing, as I began to take in the look of the airplane, I started to realise what a beautiful specimen it was. It really, really was a beguiling piece of engineering to look at. The next thing I noticed was this stunning typography on its fuselage and on its wings. So I took a lot of photographs collecting research while I was out there in Bremen, spoke to a lot of German aeronautical experts and historians, and I began to build up a better picture of what the flight actually entailed. The first idea I had was to take Teddy's newspapers. He's got these wonderful newspapers from the day, 90 years old, New York Times and so on. So I decided to take these newspapers, put them in frames, and rather than sit them in cabinets, I thought it would be a much more true representation if we actually suspended the frames from the roof trusses. Suspend them in such a way that when the viewer comes into the exhibition gallery, that they actually have to navigate around to read the newspapers. Fitz's life was very dramatic. It was full of energy and quite a remarkable, astonishing story. So I thought, to do it justice, we needed a little more. So I decided to try and divide his life up into 6 stages. And in these 6 stages, I wanted to explain each part of his story through 6 big graphic panels, which would have words and images and extra little details, just to breathe some life into the actual recounting of the story itself. I'm fortunate enough to work with one of the best typographers in the country, a fellow by the name of Bobby Tannum. I showed him the typographic specimens I had from the Bremen aircraft, and he designed a beautiful typeface influenced by the lettering on the fuselage and on the wings. So I decided to use this typeface and support it with another typeface called GT American, because this typeface is not dissimilar to the Junkers typeface, and it also shares a lot of commonalities with the flight of the Bremen, because it actually uses the kind of German grotesque forms which were taken to America and then modified to look more American. The first panel is largely coloured green, because green usually signifies kind of optimism and looking to the future, if you think of spring and so on. But also a big part of Fitz's story, he actually joined the Free State Army, and one of the first activities of the Free State Army was to paint all the red British post boxes green. So that was the actual green I decided to use. The main image is of Aldrich's garage, where Fitz as a child used to help out, and where the very first aeroplane that would ever be built in the Republic of Ireland was actually made. If you look carefully in the photograph at the top, you can actually see the skeleton of this aeroplane that Fitz actually built. And important to our story, this seemed to ignite this desire in Fitz to want to be a part of air travel, which was a very, very new thing at the time. So the 4th panel deals with the actual flight of the Bremen that left Ireland on the 12th of April and 36 hours later landed on Greenly Island. Because it took 36 hours, obviously it set off in daylight, but they had to travel by night as well. Fitzmaurice talks about how at one point, after flying blind through clouds and fog and hail and rain and snow and everything else, suddenly the clouds parted to reveal this beautiful, majestic heavenly sky. So through research I managed to find a detailed map of what the night sky actually looked like on the very night of the 12th of April. So that's what makes up the background image of the fourth panel. Also we've got the newspapers and a shot of what the cockpit of the Bremen actually looked like on that image. So as I say, they landed safely on Greenlee Island, and genuinely the world celebrated. So we can see some of the newspapers there, and in the background you can see the ticker tape parade that Fitzmaurice and his two companions were treated to in New York. So the final panel is called Departures. Unfortunately, it's fair to say that Fitzmaurice didn't enjoy the celebration that he was deserved in later life. He put forward many ideas how to put Ireland on the aviation map, but these were all rejected. He got very little backing and very little encouragement, and he was left very disillusioned, unfortunately. So the final panel deals with this, but it also tries to finish on a more optimistic note, because it shows how we've made special efforts this year in the 90th anniversary of the Bremen flight to preserve his memory and to look forward to the actual centenary. So there's images there of the research that we've collected, the people we've met on the way, and how we actually put the exhibition together. While conducting research, I met some really fantastic, enthusiastic people. So my son, Louis Deasy, who's a very talented filmmaker, came on board. So together we interviewed Michael Whelan, who's a corporal in the Irish Air Corps. We did an interview with Teddy Fenley himself. He wrote the indispensable book, Fitz and the Famous Flight. And then we interviewed Ralph James, who gave an absolutely splendid account of the way he reenacted the flight of the Bremen on its 75th anniversary. For me, making this exhibition has meant that on a dark, gloomy Irish morning, similar to when the Bremen left Baldonnel, when I'm in need of motivation and proof that there's a beautiful wide world out there, I just need to remember what Fitz did in denying the naysayers, taking a massive risk and flying, literally flying into aviation history. That's just the kind of inspiration that I need.
So this stone marker I'm standing beside commemorates the most significant aviation event in Irish aviation history. The aircraft, the Bremen, with the three crew, Fitzmaurice and the two Germans, Colin and Jungfeld, in the aircraft just before 5 AM on the 12th of April 1928. We're sitting in the aircraft on this spot, and the aircraft taxied out from here along this concrete runway as you see now, although back then it was grass, and headed towards those hills and into history. My name is Michael J. Whelan. I'm a corporal in the Irish Air Corps. I'm also the curator and historian at the Irish Air Corps Museum at Casement there at Drone Baldonnel, and I've been serving in the Air Corps Defence Forces for 29 years. Colonel James Fitzmaurice was an Irish Air Corps pilot here between 1922 and around 1928. He started off as a military soldier in the British Army. He joined at a young age, and his parents actually took him out of the military during the First World War. He found his way back in, and he managed to fight as an infantry soldier on the Battle of the Somme. He fought in a famous battle for the Schwaben Redoubt. He was nearly killed more than once. By the nature of fate, he found himself as a pilot before the end of the war. Didn't actually get to fight in the First World War as an aviation, as a pioneer or a pilot. And he came back to Ireland and was one of the first dozen pilots, ex-RAF Great War veterans, who founded the Irish Air Corps, the Irish Air Service in 1922. And he later took part in the famous Bremen flight. At the end of the Civil War in 1923, there's a rough figure of 55,000 soldiers in the Free State Army. The Civil War took 11 months, so there was a recruitment of professional soldiers into the Free State Army to fight the Republicans. So Fitzmaurice was one of the first 12 pilots in the Air Corps, professional airmen who come from British training and British service. The Free State Service itself, the Free State Army, which included the Irish Air Service and the Army, had, as I said, many thousands of professional soldiers. So there was a kind of a witch hunt at the end of the Civil War, because you had people who thought that the stepping stone theory that Michael Collins had spoken about to proper independence wasn't being adhered to. So these ex-IRA men, Republicans who hadn't been in the British forces, saw professional soldiers being promoted and given command of the army. So there was a lot of animosity over that. So you had soldiers in the Irish Air Corps and every other barracks in Ireland at the time who didn't like that the ex-British soldiers who were Irishmen being promoted, because you had to professionalise the army. If you want to have an independent state recognised by other states, you have to have professional military forces, proper trained soldiers. So brigade commanders, and generals and colonels and majors and captains and corporals and privates, all military trained, were now being promoted and given responsibility in the military, where the ex-IRA men weren't really. But these ex-British soldiers, if they hadn't been in the IRA, had absolutely no Republican credentials. So there was a lot of jealousy and animosity over what was happening there. So there was witch hunts and stories and legends and myths drawn up about these guys. A number of them were accused of committing atrocities or being spies by these ex-IRA men who were now in the Free State Army. Okay, so Fitzmaurice is one of them, and he was accused of torturing Republican prisoners down in Kerry and in Tralee. And he was also accused of burning Balbriggan with the Black and Tans. So he had to go on a number of occasions and prove where he was on those events. But he had to go to the UK, get his military service record and show where he was serving at the time. The famous Bremen flight on the 12th of April 1928 was prepared and took off from just outside this hangar. This hangar here is where I believe they fueled and prepared it just prior to taking it outside onto their hard surface. Colonel James Fitzmaurice in his memoirs speaks about how difficult the takeoff was on the morning of the 28th of April 1928 in the Bremen aircraft. You can imagine the railway sleepers created the hard surface, but they had to taxi out quite a long distance. The aircraft was very heavy with fuel, and around here at that stage there was cattle, sheep and cattle and farmland, so quite smaller area than it is now. And he actually speaks about coming to the end of the long runway and seeing sheep in front of him and worrying about hitting the sheep, and he actually thinks that he did hit one of the sheep and lifted it off the ground a few feet. So a sheep almost got to America with the aircraft and took off towards those hills into that gap and turned and headed across the centre of Ireland and out towards the Atlantic, heading for New York and finally ending up in Newfoundland on Greeley Island.
My name is Teddy Fenley. I'm the author of Fitz and the Famous Flight. So I wrote the book 20 years ago, and it was one of the most interesting exercises I have done in my lifetime. I was editor of the Lancaster Express at the time, so I was quite busy, but they say if you want anybody to do anything, you ask a busy man. So I found that despite my work commitments, I thought this was such a good story that I committed a lot of my time to it. And I still think that it's a fantastic story and one that was well worthy not only of writing about, but writing a book about it. The Irishman Colonel James Fitzmaurice, who was at this stage the Commander-in-Chief at Baldonnel of the Air Corps in Baldonnel, and his ambition was to be the first to fly the Atlantic east to west. He tried to bring the Irish government on board, help him to buy an airplane that might be fit to do the job, but all his efforts went in failure and he got very, very little backing. This year, 2018, is the 90th anniversary of the flight, so we decided to try and make something about it, such a famous event. This was impossible at the time, considered impossible by Charles Lindbergh, the greatest aviator of all time, and other American aviators. Unfortunately, a lot of English aviators and French aviators who tried it, they paid with their lives. It was banned. The flight was banned in all the European countries, perhaps except Ireland. It was too dangerous. It could achieve nothing, only destruction. But Fitzmaurice, he not only attempted it once, he attempted it twice and succeeded, where others had failed. It was an impossibility that became a reality. It was like, in later years, travelling to the moon. The American newspapers called it the greatest story of all time. Well, in my book, I think the story grows with age because it was such a wonderful achievement. And I have a few things that I feel very proud to have collected over the years that are associated with the flight. One, for instance, is a model of the plane. It's a very, very small model, but it's an exact replica. It was presented to me by a Volker Smith, and Volker Smith was the man most responsible for getting the actual aeroplane back from America to Germany, where it is now housed in the Bremen Airport Museum. I also have the actual newspapers of the time, the New York Times, of the day that the plane took off, the day that the plane was in the air, and the day that the plane landed. So they are treasured artifacts.
I'm Ralph James. I had the privilege of serving in the Air Corps for 37 years before moving on to Defence Force Headquarters. And during the time of the 75th anniversary of the Bremen flight, I was General Officer Commanding the Air Corps. For that 75th anniversary, what we tried to do was try to come up with some way of commemorating it that was different, that hadn't happened before. So one of my staff recommended that James C. Fitzmaurice was the head of the Air Corps at the time. He conducted the flight. You're the head of the Air Corps. You are still a qualified pilot. Why don't you recreate the flight with a team? So we put the plan together. Lo and behold, the Department of Defence approved the plan. Everybody thought it was a great idea. So serious planning then started, and then we're looking at it. Obviously, we weren't going to be able to do a 36.5-hour flight on our then King Air 200. So we planned a series of events around that date, that departure time, and so on. The ultimate plan of the flight was to take off 75 years to the minute after the original Bremen from Baldonnel here, and to fly around Greenlee Island Lighthouse 75 years to the minute. Day before, beautiful blue skies, lovely Canadian sunshine. Next day, at least 3 feet of snow and blowing gale. So we changed the plan for the day. We went to visit 2 survivors who had helped recover the Bremen back 75 years before. 2 elderly gentlemen who were in a hospital. 2 nicer gentlemen you couldn't meet. And what is unusual, I suppose, is there were 2 gentlemen who had been here on the morning whom we'd had out the day before as well. Pierce Cahill and Liam Cosgrave had both been here and had both come out the previous day to our event in Baldonnel. So it was just a bit of a juxtaposition that we met 2 and 2, and actually they were like brothers, all 4 of them, wonderful gentlemen who would talk away. We were with one of them in his hospital, and we were talking about, he was telling us all about what had happened. He was the man who was quoted as saying, Anton, that he ran into his parents and said, "There's a whale in the sky." We were talking to him and he said, well, it was about now, it was actually about this time. And literally we looked out the window, the fog cleared and we could see the island. Absolutely 75 years to the minute. To sum up, I suppose, Fitzmaurice's position or legacy to aviation is perhaps difficult for us to understand now, given our ability to fly great distances with extreme accuracy. When we recreated the flight, you flew over a land that was, same time of the year, was covered in ice and snow. It was all right for us. We knew plus or minus 10 feet where we were. They hadn't a notion where they were. So I think that typifies the bravery. It typifies actually what they were going into and the challenges that people have faced throughout life when they try new things. But once that was achieved, it was a major psychological break. Aircraft had already come from America to Europe, but you couldn't keep flying aeroplanes one direction. If this was going to work, if there was to be a service, it had to be a return service. They proved it. When their flight was actually plotted, they actually flew far further than Baldonnel to New York. Unfortunately, the weather had taken them completely off course. So they proved it could be done. And that was a major, major achievement for the time. Rolling on from that, he had the vision to look ahead when others weren't, where others were only trying to achieve what was there in front of them. And I think it's that spirit that then comes on, and you can roll through time where Foynes was set up, where Guinness Peat Aviation for leasing aircraft around the world, where Ireland now has an aviation industry that far exceeds that which we would have for an island nation this size. And part of that is a legacy from James C. Fitzmaurice.